From a couple weeks ago, we were in Judges. I actually showed you pictures of where Gideon, the spring that Gideon had his men drink from was located, in the valley where the Midianites camped out, and a couple of the cliffs and stuff where the caves were that they hid out in. And just as a reminder, the Midianites are oppressing Israel now. The nation of Israel came into the promised land. They were supposed to have gotten all of the Canaanites out of the land. They failed to do that. And because of that, they fell into idolatry. And of course, when the idolatry started up, God sent judgments by different nations. And when the people in Israel would get so worn down, worn out, persecuted, they would finally call out to God for help. God would send a judge, and the judge would deliver them. So let's do a little review here. Anybody remember who the first judge was? Well, yeah, Samuel. No, Samuel was later. Some people say he's the last judge, right before the king. Othniel was the first. Who was the left-handed judge? Ehud, okay. Who was the lady who had to motivate her chicken husband to get out there and get to work and do something? Deborah. And then we come to Gideon. And if you remember, this is a process that has gone on for about 120 years in the land. Now, when we study the Old Testament, we're told in the New Testament the Old Testament is recorded and preserved for our learning. When you look at this cycle, what are some things we can learn from it? You see this cycle of sin, judgment, repentance, deliverance, sin, judgment, repentance, deliverance. What are some things that we can learn from it?
Keep on the straight and narrow.
Okay, keep on the straight and narrow. Any other ideas? And I'm throwing this out because I want you to really learn how to, when you read the Old Testament, extract principles for living and stop calling the Old Testament account stories, because they're not stories. They're real events that happened to real people. We stood where this event took place, where real people stood there, and Lisa made me drink from the spring. So these are not just stories. When I think of stories, you think of like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and Disney movies. Those are fantasy stories. These are real people, and God recorded what happened, and we're told in the New Testament that it's for our example and for our learning. So what do we learn when we look at some of these cycles? Okay, we're right back to the true confession, right? We're back to confession versus I'm sorry. Exactly. Yeah, we can have victory. We don't have to stay in that cycle. How many of you have known believers who get in these ruts and these routines of getting really, really down? They finally get a little victory, they get up, and then boom, they're right back in it. And so we see that. We see that God's not going away. Okay? He didn't let them go through the cycle one time and then leave them to themselves. He's faithful in continuing to send these judges. Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that it's like the valleys and the mountains, we go up, down, up, down, up, down. When we're up on the mountaintop, walking with God, this is exactly what Israel is doing at the time.
Yeah. So when you read the Old Testament, start getting yourself in the habit of learning what principle can I pull from this to apply to my life today, because if you don't, a lot of it will mean nothing to you. If you don't learn to do that when you read the law, what do we learn in the law? We don't kill animals anymore today, right? We don't sacrifice anymore. So what can we learn from that? Well, we learn sin has consequences. Sin brings death. God is holy. God is righteous. God has his way. So you can learn and draw principles. Steve, what you got?
Paul says, don't walk as the Gentiles walk in the vanity of your mind. And we see that here, the tagline is, everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So we can see the consequences of what lies down that path if I just want to reason everything out anyway.
Yeah.
That can be pretty.
Yeah, the humanistic idea of I'm smarter than God, I'll figure it out on my own. So, and it's going to be ugly, that's for sure. So interesting things here as we look at, we see all these different judges. The god that they were currently involved with was Baal, and Baal was an agricultural god, and all kind of sin was done in worship of Baal. But we got down through all that, and we got down to verse number 11. So let's pick up here at verse number 11 in Judges chapter 6. And we'll read about Gideon. It says in Judges 6:11, "And there came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O Lord, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, then why is all this befallen us, and whence be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee?" So what we want to start looking at tonight is that God saw Gideon, and he initially calls him a mighty man of valor. Now, if you continue reading through the chapter, and we're going to kind of walk through it, the word that just kept coming to my mind was chicken. Gideon was definitely not a mighty man of valor. So again, let's think with me. What does this teach us about how God sees us? Does God see us where we're at currently, or what he's going to do through us? He sees that he knows where we're at, but he's working in our lives to get us to the point he wants us at. And we're learning some of that in the will of God, that God is working to bring us to a specific area. And we're going to see Gideon is kind of all over the map here, but God deals with us based on what he can accomplish through us, not what we think he can do or not what we think we can do. And so often we miss blessings and we miss what God has for us because we want to do things our own way, or we don't think we can do what God is leading us to do. And we see some things in Gideon. Notice in verse number 11, we see that he was fearful. It says in verse number 11, he was hiding from the Midianites. Why was he hiding? Well, if they would have caught him, they would have killed him and taken his stuff from him. So he was fearful. Notice in verse number 15, he says, and this is Gideon, he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and am the least in my father's house. He's basically saying there, I'm weak. We don't have the means to do this. We're not strong enough. We're not with the biggest house. We don't have the most supplies. We don't have the most abilities. And so he's fearful. He's weak. And then we see as we read on through, now think about this. He's talking to an angel of the Lord, the angel of the Lord that we'll see here, because he said he's seen God and he expects to die. And then we're going to see, if we get to it tonight, he's going to say, all right, I want you to do something to prove to me that I was really talking to you. And then later on, he does the whole fleece thing. You know, a lot of Christians pray that way today, and I hear them say, I'm throwing out a fleece. What's that all about? You know, we don't have to do that. So he needed a sign, and that's a sign of a lack of faith. When we need a sign from God and we can't take God at his word, that's showing the weakness of our faith. When we take God at his word, Abraham, I want you to go to another land, okay? Where's that? I'll tell you when you get there. And so what did Abraham do? He didn't say, whoa, time out. We need to get out Google Earth, and you need to print me out a map. No, he went. Scripture tells us he went out not knowing whither he went. And so he was willing to walk by faith. Now, he messed up a lot along the way, right? And if you saw my little diagram about the will of God, did I show that to y'all's class? Give me to show you our diagram real quick for those of you who weren't here. Let me draw it. All right, I'll draw it for you. Y'all get to see I'm an artist. So God had a specific place for Abraham, right? And it was God's will that Abraham go there. So point A, if you can see it, is Abraham's starting point. And then he steps in this little box. But if you read the account of Abraham, you see this little squiggly line? You can't see it? See it now, please? Okay. I need a Sharpie. Anyway, Abraham, we know from the account, was all over the place, right? But where did he end up? Point B, right where God wanted him. Okay? And so we see this idea that we really need to understand that. We don't need a sign from God. We just need to trust him. Weak faith is constantly asking for a sign. Strong faith is willing to walk. And we see here he had weak faith, and he was doubting. Notice verse 13. Now remember, he's talking to an angel, and he says to the angel, Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us. Now wait a minute, he's talking to an angel. I'm from God, and I'm talking to you about some things, and then Gideon's like, well, if the Lord's really with us, why are all these things happening? And where are all the miracles? And so we see he was fearful, he was weak, he needed a sign, he was doubting. But look at verse 14. And the Lord looked upon him and said, go in this, what's that next word? Thy might. God still was referring to him as a mighty man of valor. When God calls, folks, understand he prepares and he enables. Now, we may not be ready right now, but when it comes time for the battle, guess what? He's going to have us ready as we walk with him. And so we need to allow him to work in our lives as we walk with him. And God is dealing specifically here, not with the nation at this point, but he's dealing specifically with Gideon. He's zeroing in on an individual. And again, this is a very important point here. As you read through the Old Testament, you find numerous times God talks about the nation, right? He talks about the nation of Israel. He talks about judgment for the nation as a whole. But how often do we see him take individuals in the nation and use an individual? Think about Elijah and Elisha and others that God used. But notice what he does here. Verse number 12, it says, And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee. He didn't necessarily say he's with the nation. He didn't say he's with the army you're raising up. He said, I am with you. But look at Gideon's reply. He immediately tries to pluralize it and put it back on the nation. Look at verse 13. It says, Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where the miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us in the hands of the Midianites. What's he doing here? He's trying to get out of doing what God wanted by putting the focus back on the nation. But God puts the focus right back on him. Notice verse 14. And the Lord looked upon who? Him. And said, Go in this might. Have not I sent thee? The point here is very simple. Trust in the Lord. He's got a purpose. Act on his purpose. The New Testament would put it this way in Romans 6, reckon it to be true. Okay, we understand that word reckon. Look at the facts, consider them to be logically true, and then act on those facts. And basically that's what God is telling Gideon here. Look, I've got a plan for you. I've got a purpose for you. I'm going to empower you. Don't worry about those people. Don't worry about the us and the nation. You do what I've called you to do. Think about Jesus and Peter. We got to go to the place where, I don't know if y'all got to go there, the place where they think that Jesus restored Peter to the ministry by the Sea of Galilee. Remember, they'd been fishing, and they fished all night, they didn't catch anything, and they saw somebody on the shore with a fire going, and when they came, they realized it was Jesus, and that's when Jesus goes through the whole thing with Peter of, lovest thou me more than these, feed my sheep, and all that. And remember, after all that, Jesus finally gets Peter's attention, and then Peter being Peter, anybody remember what he said? Yeah, he looks back and he says, what about that disciple? What about John? Remember what Jesus told him? What's that to thee? And this is basically what God is telling Gideon here. Gideon, don't worry about the nation. I'm going to deliver the nation through you. Don't worry about the us and the plural. I'm dealing with you right now. I think if believers got a hold of just that and focused on what God is doing in my life right now and quit worrying about trying to manage everybody else's life and why this person's got a better life than I do, or that person got a better break than I got, or whatever, and we dealt with what God was dealing with in our life, I think we come out a whole lot better off, don't y'all? This is what he's telling him here. And so Gideon is being taught, God is bringing him along to conform him into what he wants him to be, a mighty man of valor. Now, again, Gideon's still doubting. Notice verse 15. It says, And he said to him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor, in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite Midian as one man. Now, remember the description of the Midianites. How many of them were there? There were a bunch. All right, it says there was a great multitude, and they came into Israel like a plague of grasshoppers. All right, I mean, there was like a swarm of them. I don't know if there's a number. It's kind of a trick question. And so God is going to use Gideon. Gideon is doubting. He's questioning. And honestly, when we're confronted with something bigger than we are, it's easy to sit back and look at Gideon and shake our heads, right? But if we're honest, how many of us have not done the same thing? God brings something up in our life. It's bigger than we are. And what's the first thing we do a lot of times? Cece, we can't do it. We can't do it. Or we do what? Whine or complain. Why me? Why not take that to Rob and let him handle it, you know? So we see Gideon doing this, and God is reassuring him, and he's calling him to act now. And so the point of this is, folks, that we may not look at ourselves, and I'm going to use a term God used with Gideon, as mighty men of valor or mighty ladies of valor. But God working through our life can accomplish things through our life that we never imagined if we're willing to walk with him and just simply obey him and operate by faith. That means that we need to trust in him and rest in his power. God is not telling Gideon to go out and kill him. He says, go in this thy might. And he's reminding him here that he's going to empower him. We need to trust God to do that. Rest in his promises, rest in his power, and watch God work. Have you ever stopped and thought about this, that following with weak faith is better than not following at all? Let me throw out a question to you. How many of you would say you're completely 100% satisfied where your faith is right now? It's as strong as you think it's ever been. It's as strong as you think it'll ever be. And you're 100% satisfied with it. Anybody? Okay, if you're honest, hopefully you'll say, no, my faith needs strengthening. And that's where we find Gideon. He saw the need. He knew the Israelites need to be delivered. God said, I'm going to use you, but obviously he has a weak faith here. And so we get down to verse 17. It says, and he said unto him, if now I have found grace in thy sight. Have you ever noticed when we doubt, we say stupid things? Now, question. Do you think Gideon had already found grace in God's sight? How do we know that? He's talking to him, okay? So, when we start doubting and when we start operating by sight and not by faith, we really get ridiculous, but we don't usually realize it until we look back, right? And we say, man, my faith was so weak. That was so silly not to trust God. But here we have Gideon saying that, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. And I'm thinking, what more sign do you need than you're standing here talking with me? Okay, that would be like you guys say, hey, pastor, give us a sign that you're preaching to us tonight. Oh, I'm preaching. There's your sign. I mean, I don't know. But it's a reflection of where Gideon is. And it's interesting as we look at this, God doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't say, Gideon, he's not doing like we're doing and picking on Gideon for having weak faith, right? He doesn't say anything. Gideon goes on and says, depart not hence, I pray thee, until I come unto thee and bring my present and set it before you. And he said, I will tarry. The he here is the angel. The angel says, I'll wait till you come again. So Gideon's going to go get something. He's going to offer it. Gideon goes in, let me just read it and then we'll talk about it. Gideon went in and made ready a kid and unleavened cakes and an ephah of flour and flesh he put in the basket. And he put broth in a pot and brought it out under the oak and presented it. And the angel of God said unto him, take the flesh and the unleavened bread and cakes and lay them upon this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes. And there arose a fire up out of the rock and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. So Gideon goes and gets this offering and this gift he wants to give the angel, and the angel basically burns it up and makes it go away. So, but notice, do you ever imagine these things going on when you're reading, especially the Old Testament? You've got the angel of the Lord talking to Gideon. Gideon knows who he is. He says, how do I know I'm really talking to you? And you can almost see the angel roll his eyes. You know, it's like, these humans, Lord, what's up with that? And so Gideon says, I'm going to go do something, and the angel of the Lord is hanging around. But we don't see a rebuke. We see God do this miracle of burning these things up. So what does that tell us about our faith when it's weak? Does God condemn us for having weak faith? Does he belittle us for having weak faith? What is God's goal for our faith? Is it to keep it weak and to beat us down when we struggle, or to strengthen our faith? I think he wants to strengthen our faith. You know, often we'll say, you know, we're not really like Gideon, but we want to see God do something so we know for sure, right? Well, God is interesting here that God used what Gideon had to prove the fact that he was with him. God didn't do anything supernatural before the flame came up, right? Gideon went and got the meat. Gideon went and got the bread. Gideon went and got the kid. And by the way, the kid is an animal, not a kid, okay? Gideon did all of that. And sometimes God will use what we have to reveal himself to us as we walk by faith. And so Gideon is doing all this, not God. The angel's waiting and watching. And now the subtle teaching. Gideon's gone and done all this, and now notice the instruction in verse number 21. The angel of the Lord verse number 20, and the angel of God said to him, take the flesh and the unleavened bread and the cakes and lay them upon the rock and pour out the broth, and he did so. What's going on here in this verse, in verse number 20? Talk to me. Think with me. Think when you read. What's the angel of the Lord doing here? What's he teaching Gideon? Obedience. Okay? Here's a guy that says, I'm too scared to do anything. I can't do it. And now the angel is using what Gideon has, what Gideon went and got, and he's telling him to do something, and Gideon does it. Folks, when the Lord works in our life, he works through what we have and our obedience in walking with him. Gideon didn't do anything out of the ordinary here, so God is able to use him. And so he says, take it, lay it down. This is the beginning of training. He's learning obedience. The point is this: a weak faith, but a willing faith can be used for God to accomplish God's purposes. And God is training him. And notice what happens to Gideon, 3 things after the angel disappears. It says in verse 22, and when Gideon perceived that he was an angel of the Lord, Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, because I've seen an angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said unto him, peace be unto thee, fear not, thou shalt not die. Okay, real quick, why did he think he was going to die? He'd seen deity, right? So he thought he was going to die. Some things here. Notice first, Gideon's starting to cultivate a little discernment. After talking with the angel, he realized, wait a minute, this wasn't just an angel. This is the angel of the Lord. And we see some discernment coming in right there. In verse number 23, we see some action and some assurance. Notice in verse number 24, he says, then Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord and called it Jehovah Shalom unto this day, yet in Orpha, today as it is, yet in Orpha, and of the Abiezrites. And so he builds an altar to the Lord. Now, let's think just a minute. God saw him. He called him a mighty man of valor. What was he doing when God called him mighty man of valor? He was hiding behind a winepress threshing the wheat. What's he doing now? He's building an altar. The altars we're talking about, folks, these are good-sized altars. They make them out of rocks. I think they make everything in Israel out of the rocks that are all over. And the altars that I saw, I've got a picture that we'll try to show you, an altar that was a Moloch altar, was probably as long as from right here all the way back to where Steve's sitting, and at least as wide as that section. It was circular. The altar that Jeroboam built in Dan was massive. These altars, it's not like the little grills we have, those little portable grills. He built an altar. And this is significant because now, this is action. Now the Midianites can see it. Baal worship was the normal thing to do. He wasn't doing normal anymore. He was learning to walk by faith, and I don't even know if he even realized it. He wasn't doing normal. And so he builds this altar, which is out there. And he goes on and ultimately does a sacrifice here. But let's continue. In verse number 24, he has a new recognition of who God is. It says, and Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord and called it Jehovah Shalom. The word Jehovah Shalom means Jehovah is peace. That God is my source of peace. Jehovah Shalom. And he's growing. His faith is growing. Notice verse 25. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that's by it. And he built an altar unto the Lord, and build an altar unto the Lord thy God on top of this rock in the ordered place, and take the second bullock and offer a burnt sacrifice with wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had said unto him, and it was so because he feared his father's household and the men of the city that he could not do it by day, but he did it by night. And when the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by it, and the second bullock was offered upon the altar that it was built. So we see Gideon now doing things that just earlier in the chapter, Gideon, I can't do it. So not only is he building an altar, now he's going to his dad's Baal worship altar, and he's tearing the altar down. He's got 10 men following him. He cuts down the groves, and these groves were like thick trees. This is not easy work. And he's tearing his dad's altar up. Anybody ever tear something of your dad's up and live to tell about it? My brother, who is an excellent mechanic now, and if he's watching this, I'll hear about it later. One of his first mechanical exploits was on my dad's lawnmower. He took it completely apart. He just took it apart. It didn't go back together. Needless to say, our dad was not very happy with that. So we see this idea here of Gideon being a mighty man of valor. He's still feared. He's doing this at night, but he's obeying God now, and he's walking by faith. And folks, to be mighty with God, it simply comes by walking through faith. Allow God to use us in spite of our fears, in spite of our apprehensions, in spite of our doubts. Step forward in faith, trusting Him, and let Him work through us. And then quickly tonight, we'll see the response to the righteousness. Look in verse 28 or verse 29. The Baal worshipers get up, and it says in verse 29, they said one to another, who hath done this thing? And when they inquired and asked, they said, Gideon the son of Joash hath done this thing. And the men of the city said unto Joash, bring out thy son, that he may die, because he hath cast down the altar of Baal, and because he hath cut down the grove that was by it. And Joash said unto all that stood against him, will you plead for Baal? Will you save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death whilst it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. Therefore, on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him, because he hath cast down his altar. And so we see Gideon is building an altar to the one true God. He's starting to destroy a Baal worship, and the Baal worshipers are losing it. They want to kill him. And again, it's interesting, just from a couple weeks ago, does anybody remember what god the Midianites worshipped? Baal. The Midianites were Baal worshipers also. And so you've got infighting here with the Baal worshipers. So we see the resistance to righteousness. We see their attachment to religion. They were suffering just like Gideon was. The Midianites, even though these people were Baal worshipers like the Midianites, that didn't bring them any favor from the Midianites when it came to steal the food and to steal the animals and to take everything they had worked raising. The Midianites were treating the Baal worshipers just like everybody else. But they were attached to that religion because that religion catered to the flesh. Then we see a desire to kill Gideon. Verse number 30. And what we see here is God's people who are attached to self-righteousness and empty religion are very confrontational toward the things of God. Remember in Acts chapter 7 when Stephen is preaching? And Stephen confronts those people with their self-righteousness and their empty religion. How did those folks respond there in Acts chapter 7, that good group of godly people? Yeah, it says they gnashed on him with their teeth. They covered their ears and screamed and ran out and gnashed on him with their teeth. I don't know if that means they bit him or, they were throwing a wide open 2-year-old fit, okay? And then they took him out and stoned him. And so we see here Gideon is doing the right thing. And then finally Gideon's dad stands up and says, look, if Baal is this God that you think he is, let Baal kill him. Does that kind of sound like somebody else who challenged Baal and Baal was powerless? Mount Carmel, Elijah, when he taunted the prophets of Baal and they couldn't bring fire down, and God brought down the fire and burned up the rocks and the offering and the water and everything else. And so we see Gideon growing as God works through him. He's still scared. His faith is still weak. But even in weak faith, he's stepping out. And folks, what a great lesson for us. We don't have to have this super Christian faith for God to use us. We just have to be willing to walk with him and trust him and take that next step. And as we've seen here, as we'll see again maybe later, that even when we doubt and we ask God for more, God didn't rebuke Gideon when he asks for a sign. He doesn't rebuke Gideon later when he goes through the whole laying out the fleece thing. God shows himself strong. And so we can walk with God. Our faith can be strengthened. Remember, God sees us where he wants to take us. And he's working in our lives in spite of where we are right now to get us there. And that's one of the great lessons we see from the life of Gideon. Obviously, in chapter 6, initially, he doesn't look like a mighty man of valor. But by the time you get to the end of the account, how many of you would want to go up against almost an uncountable army with 300 guys with lamps? Okay? That's a mighty man of valor. And they kill them, and they have victory. And so we see that God eventually worked through Gideon to get Gideon where God wanted Gideon to be. And so for us, we take the lesson from it. Walk by faith. Trust God. Allow him to work and move in our lives as he would move. So I hope this is helpful to you. And I hope, if nothing else, that maybe as you go back and you read these Old Testament narratives, again, get away from the story concept. God is teaching us lessons here. So many lessons about who he is and how he works and what he can accomplish as we walk with him. So I hope that's helpful to you. Let's go ahead and stop there tonight and let's pray. Father, thank you tonight for this time, and we thank you for this account of Gideon and what took place there and how you worked through him and brought him to the point where you would have him to be. We pray you would help us to learn to walk by faith, to trust you.